Indicators and monitoring semi-natural areas. The aesthetic value of the landscape. Why is landscapes important? Values are inherited and learned. Values are also cultural bound, and cultural implements certain values. Professions implement certain values as well as trends. Values are tied to certain time. Values are the goals that guides our choices. Values are always subjective. Let's have a quick look on different types of landscapes. Here we have an open wooded meadow with cattle. Some have memories from this. Children may have memories from their childhood when they have visited the grandmother, but a farmer have memories from working with the animals. They have spent their childhood by the sea, and rocky places like this are very familiar for them. Have perhaps been fishing or bird spotting, and they are familiar with these kinds of areas. A field in the background and a forest pasture with some trees and the shadow of the trees against the sun. Anemones have always been early in the spring and usually close to the Mother Day in Finland. Many children have picked these flowers for their mothers. Yellow sedum is growing here on a rocky mountain. The seashore is very familiar for some. Here is a barn close to a riverside in Estonia, and the river is a part of a sea bay. I have been spending my summers in this landscape for the last 30 years. This landscape is close to my soul. Every spring my meadow is blooming so fairly. 100 years ago, cattle were gathered close to the milking places for the night time, and there it could be very barren. They were taken out in the forest for grazing daytime. Then it could look like this. A view that was so common 100 years ago. Most of us don't recognize this at all anymore. Pine forest and a lot of cattle in between. Small trees in a pasture 100 years ago. They have all been heavily grazed. You can see it on the way how they look. So just a quick reminder that there have been small changes in landscapes. Yes, for millennia we can say Neolithics made changes, Iron Age and Roman Age made changes, and early medieval made changes. Then in the 10th and 11th century we got in Europe greater medieval land reclamation. And this continued during the Revolutionary Age in the 18th century, and then from the 19th century upwards the change has been tremendously big. Quality of the management of semi-natural areas. Traditional landscapes are managed and evaluated, but the quality of the management have been less evaluated and in focus. By following the selected indicators, we can draw conclusions on how well the management works. Years are not similar, the weather changes, and therefore long-term monitoring is needed. Plants also have their own rhythms, and the secrets of all plants are not yet known. Botricium lunaria is really a small plant, in the beginning only 5 centimeters high. Later on it grows a little bit higher, And this is really a magical plant. First of all, it is really difficult to spot it. And another thing is that it is really moody. It doesn't grow on the same places, and it can become nearly for many years that you don't see it at all, and then suddenly you see it again. I have been reading in an old book that this plant actually, in the springtime when it comes, it tastes like peas. They are fairly rare, so even if I have them on my meadow, I have never ever tried to eat them. This is an orchid, Gymnadenia conopsea. Orchids are very nice plants to follow in the wild. They change, they do cross-pollinate, and they can have strange outlook some years. They are kind of, not all of them are not stable yet. They are like still looking for their places in the ecosystems. I have now for 20 years been following and calculating how many of these orchids I have on my meadow. And you can see here, I started in 2003, and just last year it was filled up with 20 years of following statistics. And you can see that it varies really a lot. This plant is very dependent on the weather. So it likes when it is wet springs and water in the spring, then there will be more of them. But it seems like it have an own inner cycle also. Some years you can see there are zeros out of them, 2008 and 2011. I'm sad to say that those years my sheep were eating all of them. My sheep really liked them because they smell very nice. They don't start to smell immediately. So when they start to open the flowers, they open it from the bottom and it go upwards. And really, when nearly all are open, then it is sending out this very nice scent. It is a little bit like cinnamon, perhaps, and that scent the sheep liked really much. From one plant come thousands and thousands of seeds. So even if the sheep are eating all of them, and if one is maturing, then it will be possible for them to distribute a lot of seed around. Documentation. Documentation is the most important tool for monitoring traditional semi-rural areas. Documentation should be done by writing. For example, you can keep a diary as a paper version, or use electronic tools by writing a blog or creating an Instagram account, or you can have even a Facebook group for the area that you monitor. Take plenty of photos and videos, also winter time. Maintain lists of different plants and animals to keep a track on them. I'm using an Excel table for my plant monitoring, and I have a few plants that I am following each year, and usually I'm calculating flowering plants. So some plants may sometimes have only green leaves, but they are not flowering. For example, this Listera ovata that you see on this picture, it is an orchid. It's green, it doesn't look that nice. Most of them have just these two leaves together, but some of them are blooming, and then they will becoming this big long flower in the middle of them. And the monitoring is really easy. I just calculate them, and then I write the place and the date and how many I calculated, and I make also some kind of notes. For example, my first note in 2005, I have been writing Listera ovata, very much welcome. So it was the first time I noticed it on the meadow. So when you are choosing the indicator plants, then it could be some endangered plants or some rare plant. But yeah, and there are these good plants called plus plants, and there are those bad plants that are called minus plants. And of course, you could also track them. You would like to have less of the minus plants and more of the good plants. There are some kind of old weeds as well, field weeds, but they are really tricky to find. I have never managed to find them, but they are good to keep in mind that there are those if they one day will come in front of you. There may be also some old food plants at your semi-natural meadow. I cannot just remember anyone just now. There are more dying plants, medicinal plants, and maybe occasionally also some relic plants. Dying plants are like bog myrtle, oregano, Dias rocket, and St. John's wort. And medicinal plants for example, then hops and elecampane, chamomile, and Breckland thyme. And relic plants, it could be yarrow, greater burdock, which perhaps we in the first run wouldn't think that is a relic plant, but yes, it is. It was brought in as a food plant, and in Japan and other places in Asia, they are actually eating greater burdock's roots. Then cumin, Karum Karvi, that was growing nearly all over on meadows before, and it has been a large export plant. Actually, the seeds of Karum Karvi were collected in the 19th century on the meadows and exported from Finland. And the amounts they exported, they were so big that I have always been thinking that how could they manage to pick so many of them, because the Karum Karvi seed is really small. And still today, Karum Karvi is growing very well in Finland, and Finland is actually one of the biggest exporters of Karum Karvi. And then we have also the lamb's quarters, that is a very old plant and relict, and also that one was brought to our country as a food plant. What you then in the end really is going to choose for plant, it is much up to you and your own relationship then to the plants that you will develop in your own area. So maybe there is one of the plants that you really much like, and you would like to then start to follow that plant. And of course, if it's a plant that there are thousands of, then it takes a lot of time to calculate them. Then it's perhaps better to choose some plant that is a good meadow plant, but there are not so many of them. For you now, compiled from different sources about these good plants, which plants are considered good, and different organizations, they consider a little bit different types of plants to being good. And here are now, I think, 5 pages of good plants. You don't have to read. Sometimes want to start to make inventories and monitor some plants, then it will be online. The presentation is online as well. Instead of this very long list that I had on many slides, then here is a short list. And here are both such plants that you could start to make inventories on, and such plants that you could check if they are growing in your semi-natural area. This list was made by the Cultural Heritage Association in Finland. As we now have been looking at the good plants, then a few words about the bad plants. There are some plants that love nitrogen, and dandelions and nettles are two of those. But both plants are not purely bad plants, because dandelions are really good for pollinator plants, and it's also a food plant. You can both eat the leaves in the early spring, and the flower can also be used in many ways. And nettle which also loves nitrogen and a lot of nutrients. It's also a good food plant. Fern and raspberries, they can very easily start to spread in large areas in areas of the semi-natural habitats that not are managed in the correct way. And of course we have the invasive species such as the large-leaved lupine, tall goldenrod, Rosa rugosa, common poppy, and wood forget-me-not. All of these can be really bad spreading plants and cover up and kill all the other plants. In the semi-natural areas there is also a lot of animals, mainly then perhaps small insects and both bumblebees, butterflies and other small pollinators. Taking photos is the best work method for this if you want to start to follow them. You can make a presentation or a document where you collect pictures of these different animals. And then you can try to identify the varieties yourself, or you can ask for help if needed, and you can join an insect expert group on social media. And by sharing information online, you can also get identification help. I think it's pretty easy to get identification help because there is really a lot of very kind persons out there in the cyberspace that are very knowledgeable and also want to give a hand in species identification. Of course, you have to learn who these people are. Here you can see a picture I have been taking of the insects that I have in my meadow, or at least part of them, and I have made a presentation of them, and then I have got help to identify them then, most of them. So you have to take a good photo so that somebody will be able to identify them. But I collect mine in a PowerPoint. Just an example what kind of plants I follow at my own meadow. So I have this very long list here with plants. Many of them are orchids, but actually it's only the bolded one that I try to do every year. Some of these other orchids I have just like had only once or twice, and some are coming and going and they are not all the time. And the two at the end, Primula farinosa and Trolleus europaeus, they have actually died out on my meadow now. Trolleus europaeus, my sheep were eating, and after that they didn't come back. And Primula farinosa, it needs quite well-managed land, very short grass, for example, and then it also like it to be pretty humid to area. So Gymnadenia conopsea and also Gymnadenia conopsea variation alba, the white one, those are I calculate, and alba I have only had 3 times on the meadow, so perhaps one day it will come again. Orchids militaris I also calculate every year, as I do for Listera ovata. They are orchids, all of those. Then Gentiana cruciata is not an orchid, but I don't have that many of them, and I'm calculating mostly only the blooming ones, and this is kind of growing population now at my meadow. So I do something perhaps that something good that they like. And this plant is very interesting because it's a myrmecophile, so it or it's not a myrmecophile, but there is a butterfly that puts its eggs on this plant, and that butterfly is a myrmecophile. So it has this connection with both ants and a butterfly on my meadow. So that's why I like it. Antenaria dioica, yeah, not every year. I have not been calculating them, but I try to do it once in a while. Every 5th year or so, I try to check them if there are more or less of them. And Verbascum nigrum also, I try to collect or try to count them every year, but I don't manage to do it every year. And then sometimes I see some very strange things like these two plants. There are nothing like these plants, so something happened in them, some kind of mutation. And the right plant, it may be that some uh, snails have been on it in a phase when it was developing. It's a plantago plant, the one to here to the left, and I had several plants looking like this. They shouldn't be looking like this, and they had also something wrong with them. So when you start to look at different plants on a Seminatra meadow, you will notice all kinds of strange things. You may find plants that really are not there. They can be just cross-pollinated result, and you won't have them again the next year. But if you're lucky, you may find something new, a new species. That happens once in a while as well.